Welcome to this unit where I want to shortly explain how we can use R to transform a dataset which is in a wide format into a long format. Well, to get an idea what I'm talking about, let's have a look at the dataset I'm going to use. So I'm going to open an Excel file where I prepared the dataset, which is this one here. And well, if this is opened, I have to directly do one more step because I'm going to use the reshape function, and the reshape function requires the data to be in a data.frame format. If you use a more recent version of R, something like Read Excel or other versions, will open your data set not as a data frame, but as a Tibble table. Well, this might be a problem because some functions will not recognize this type of data organization. So what we're going to do before we do any calculations, any transformations at all, we're going to transform our data set into the data.frame format, which is easily done by just as s.data.frame and the name of the data set. Well, data set looks like this. So we have two sets of 4 variables each. So for example, if you conducted a choice experiment and you had your participants, like 10 participants here, compare 2 sets of choice cards. So this would be describing the first set, this would be describing the second set, the characteristics of those sets. And what you want to do to evaluate all of this, for example, in Apollo, or if you just want to summarize this, we would have to get those 4 put one below the other. So it should be those 10 numbers, then those 10, those 10, those 10, summarized into a single variable. Same thing for those 4 sets. In addition, we have the age variable here, age, which is directly linked to the participant ID. So those would then be copied one after another, so you would have 4 times this and the respective ID here. Well, how do we achieve to get something like this? That's actually the first part of the reshape function. That's what I'm going to explain in this context. Reshape. Here, the first part, I have to tell him which data set to actually transform. This data set, of course, if we transform from wide to long, should be in a wide format, which is more or less this format. Then we're going to tell him which variables he should summarize. Since I'm going to do this here for 2 variables, well, or 2 sets of variables, I have to tell him, well, it's a list, so it's more than one set. The first set is this array consisting of the variables var11 till var14, and the second set is given in this array from var21 to var24. I'm going to tell him as well, okay, I have wide data, I want it transformed into long data. And well, if he transforms this, he will introduce a new index variable, which tells me does it come from this one, this one, this one, or that one. So this new index variable I will call x here. So all the data coming from this one or that one will have a 1, coming from those 2 will have a 2. And well, I also have to tell him what's the participant's ID. So that's here variable ID. And since I want to summarize these 2 sets of variables into one variable each, I have to tell him how these 2 new variables should be named. So I'm just calling them var1 and 2. If I just execute this, we're going to see how it will look. So it works relatively fast. So as I explained, he will introduce a new index variable, which has values 1, 2, 3, and 4. And he has written all these values one below the other and so forth. The ID and the age he just copied for each set. So they are fixed for each set of this new index variable. Well, we could stop here because that's more or less the data you in most cases would require. Or we could go one step further and say, well, we could summarize these two variables into another variable as well, adding a third index variable which tells us does it come from this set or from that set. If we're going to do this as well, we are again using reshape with the long function. So now we're going to summarize two variables into a single new variable. We needed the list since we had two sets of variables in the first step. Now we only have one set of variables, only these two into one new variable. So that's why we do not have to use this list version, can simply put the names of these two variables into an array. Again, directions long. With time variable, I'm going to set the name for my new index variable. Here I'm calling it y. And I have to tell him which are the already existing index variables, which are participant ID and the just created index variable x. And then I have to give a name to the newly to be generated variable, which I call here values. Well, let's see how this turns out. Just execute this. Of course, it becomes longer and longer each time. Now I just have a single column, a single variable with all the values, and I have three index variables. The age is just copied repeatedly, one after another, after another, after another. The interesting thing are also repeats or reports in front here, which case we are actually considering. So this is participant 1, which has variable 1 or set 1, and there the first of the 4 options. And we can see the different alternatives from top to bottom. Well, this is the maximum we can go with the long format. And well, theoretically, we would also be finished with this unit because the main aim was how to get from wide to long. But okay, it could also be interesting to go all the way back because in some cases you have the long data, you use it, but you might need wide data as well. So how to get back? Well, that's what I prepared down here. We can use the same reshape function, but now in the opposite direction. So that's this part here. If I said opposite direction, that's why direction now reads not as long as before, but as wide. Well, and we have two index variables we would have to, well, dissolve in one way or another. So in our situation, I decided to go with the y variable first because this was also the last step we did. So we're basically going to go back on the last step. So what we do is first off, we're going to tell him with the v.names where all the data is stored. This is values. Then we're going to tell him, okay, with time variable, this index you should use to split up to widen the data. Those two indices you should still keep. So you will still keep participant ID and the x variable for first, second, third, fourth part. Well, direction is wide. So let's execute this and have a look. And we see here, he actually split it up into two partial variables. So exactly the same what we had before we executed the second long command. Again, we just have 4 sets described by this x variable. Now we can widen this even further, getting back to our original data set. That's the second part. Again, we're going to use the data from before. Now I find my data in values 1 and values 2. So with v names, I'm going to give him those 2 names. Here we also see if I have a single value, I can go with just in parentheses, just in quotation marks. If I have 2 of them, I have to go with an array. Well, here he gets the data. This is the index he should split up. That's the x variable here. And he should retain the index for the participant ID. He should widen the data, so that's why we have direction wide. If I execute this part, let's have a look. Then it turns out like this, starts with the ID, then age, and then the 2 sets of 4 variables each. Of course, if we look closely, this is not as the original data set looked. First off, the names are slightly different, but the order is different. Well, first I have all the ID variables, then I have all the constants, so age remains the same, it's only bound to ID, so he lists those which were not summarized first, and then he just goes first, second, second, second. So he switches up the order a little bit. Only the first alternatives, the second alternative, third, fourth alternatives, which we ordered differently in the outset in the original data set. Well, we could really recreate also the order of the first data set, but then we would have to go the other way around. Then we would have first to split up by x and then by y. This is also possible and actually not this big of a deal. I just decided to go starting here this way and then make each of the steps go back and cancel it out. Well, that's basically concluding this unit. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you could take away something from it. And I say goodbye and see you next time.